They say the most dangerous prison is the one where you can't see the bars. Every day, millions of us wake up to lives that are meticulously controlled by forces we've unknowingly surrendered to. The constant ping of notifications determining our attention, the crushing weight of debt dictating our choices, the paralyzing fear of others' judgments shaping our decisions. Like hamsters on a wheel, we keep running faster, chasing an ever-elusive sense of enough, while our authentic dreams gather dust in the corner of our minds. The tragedy isn't just that we're living on autopilot. It's that we've forgotten we have the power to take back control. You see, we've been conditioned to believe that our voice is our power, that speaking up, speaking out, and being heard is the only way to assert ourselves in this noisy world. But there's a deeper truth that most of us have forgotten, a truth that the greatest spiritual teachers and leaders throughout history understood intimately. When you choose silence, you're not choosing weakness. You're not surrendering. You're not giving in. Instead, you're tapping into a wellspring of power that most people never access because they're too busy reacting, too focused on proving themselves right, too caught up in the endless cycle of action and reaction. Let me share something with you that changed my entire perspective on human interaction. During my early years of spiritual seeking, I encountered a man who had mastered the art of silence. He didn't wear it like a badge of honor or use it as a weapon. His silence was neither cold nor hostile. It was complete presence. When others would attack him verbally or challenge his beliefs, he would respond with a quality of silence that was more powerful than any words could ever be. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of compassion, understanding, and an unshakable inner strength. It made his attackers uncomfortable, not because he was trying to hurt them, but because they were forced to confront their own unresolved issues, their own pain. You see, when someone comes at you with anger, they're expecting a specific response. They're seeking validation for their emotional state. They want you to match their energy, to engage in their drama, to play your assigned role in their internal story. But when you respond with conscious silence, you're essentially holding up a mirror to their behavior. And that mirror can be more transformative than any argument you could ever win. Think about water for a moment. When you throw a stone into a still pond, what happens? The water doesn't fight back. It doesn't try to push the stone away. It simply accepts the stone, embraces it, and returns to its natural state of stillness. The stone may create temporary ripples, but it cannot disturb the fundamental nature of the water. This is the kind of silence I'm talking about. Not the silence of suppression, where you're biting your tongue and seething inside. Not the silence of passive aggression, where your quiet is actually a form of punishment. I'm talking about the silence that comes from a place of such deep inner strength that you no longer need to prove anything to anyone. The silence has the power to break through the walls people build around themselves. It can shatter their preconceptions, dissolve their defenses, and create space for real transformation. Why? Because when you refuse to engage with chaos, you force others to sit with their own energy. When you don't match their anger with anger, you create a void that can only be filled with self-reflection. But let me be clear, this isn't about being passive or allowing yourself to be mistreated. This is about operating from a higher level of consciousness. It's about understanding that some battles don't need to be fought because they're not really battles at all. They're opportunities for transformation. When you master this kind of silence, you'll notice something remarkable happening in your relationships. People who once tried to provoke you will begin to feel uncomfortable with their own behavior. Those who sought conflict will find themselves reconsidering their approach. The energy vampires who fed off your reactions will discover that their old tactics no longer work. This is because true silence, conscious, aware, powerful silence, creates a space where transformation becomes possible. It's like the pause between musical notes that gives the melody its meaning. It's the moment between action and reaction where real choice exists. I've seen this principle work in the most challenging situations. In families torn apart by years of conflict, in workplaces poisoned by toxic relationships, in communities divided by deep-seated differences. The person who masters conscious silence becomes a force for transformation without ever having to force change upon others. Consider for a moment the sun's relationship with a flower. The sun doesn't command the flower to grow. It doesn't argue with the seed about its potential. It simply shows up day after day, radiating its truth, creating the conditions where growth becomes natural and inevitable. Your silence can have the same effect on the people around you. This is particularly powerful when dealing with those who have become accustomed to using anger as a tool for control. These individuals have usually developed their patterns over years or even decades. They expect resistance. They anticipate argument. They're prepared for conflict. What they're not prepared for is the mirror of conscious silence. When you stand in your power and choose not to engage with their chaos, you're doing more than just avoiding conflict. You're showing them a different way of being. You're demonstrating that there's another choice besides fight or flight. You're embodying the possibility of peace in the face of provocation. This isn't easy work. It requires a level of self-mastery that goes beyond simple self-control. It demands that you develop an unshakable connection with your own inner truth. It asks you to trust in the power of your presence more than but the rewards of this practice are profound and far-reaching. As you develop this capacity for transformative silence, you'll find that your entire relationship with conflict begins to change. You'll no longer feel the need to defend yourself against every accusation or respond to every provocation. You'll develop the ability to distinguish between situations that require your voice and those that require your silence. The power of transformative silence becomes most evident in our closest relationships. These are the relationships where we're most tempted to react, where our buttons are most easily pushed, and where our emotional investments run deepest. But these are also the relationships where conscious silence can work its most profound magic. Consider the parent who constantly criticizes their adult child. Every achievement is met with a but. Every life choice is questioned. Every decision is second-guessed. The natural response would be to defend, explain, or counterattack. But what happens when that adult child chooses the path of conscious silence instead? At first, nothing seems to change. The criticism continues. The judgment flows. The parent keeps trying to provoke a response, to engage in the familiar dance of attack and defend. But something subtle begins to shift. Without the usual pushback, without the emotional fuel of reaction, the critical parent begins to hear their own words more clearly. The silence creates a space where their own voice echoes back to them, revealing patterns they might never have recognized in the heat of argument. This is where the break-in begins. Not a violent shattering, but a gentle crumbling of old patterns. The parent who has always relied on criticism to maintain control suddenly finds themselves in new territory. Their words, met with calm presence instead of defensive reaction, begin to lose their power. And in that loss of power lies the potential for transformation. But let's be clear about what this silence asks of us. IU asks us to stand in our truth without needing to defend it. It asks us to trust in our own worth without requiring external validation. It asks us to hold space for another's pain without taking responsibility for healing it. This is advanced spiritual work, but it's work that every one of us is capable of doing. The key lies in understanding that your silence isn't passive, it's deeply active. It's not the silence of submission, but the silence of sovereignty. When you choose not to engage with drama, you're not running away from conflict, you're transcending it. You're operating from a higher level of consciousness, where the old rules of engagement no longer apply. Think of it like this. When someone throws their anger at you, they're essentially handing you a hot coal. The expected response is to catch it and throw it back, perpetuating a cycle of pain. But what if you simply step aside? The coal falls to the ground, and the person throwing it is left to consider why they're burning themselves. This practice becomes particularly powerful in the workplace, where emotional reactions can have professional consequences. Consider the colleague who constantly tries to undermine you in meetings, who takes credit for your work, who spreads subtle doubt about your capabilities. The conventional wisdom would tell you to stand up for yourself, to call them out, to fight fire with fire. But what if instead you met their attempts at provocation with unshakable presence? Not with passive-aggressive silence, not with cold withdrawal, but with the kind of silence that comes from knowing your own worth so deeply that you don't need to defend it. This is the silence that breaks old patterns, that disrupts toxic dynamics, that creates space for new possibilities. I've witnessed this transformation in countless situations. The competitive colleague who gradually becomes a collaborator, the critical parent who slowly softens into support, the angry partner who finally feels safe enough to be vulnerable. These changes don't happen overnight, but they happen with remarkable consistency when one person commits to the practice of conscious silence. This silence has a quality to it that must be understood. It's not about withdrawal or disconnection. It's about maintaining such a strong connection to your own center that you can stay fully present while choosing not to engage with drama. It's about being so grounded in your truth that you don't need to convince others of it. This brings us to a crucial point. See, the power of silence lies not in what it withholds, but in what it reveals. When you choose not to react, you create a space where others can see themselves more clearly. Your silence becomes a mirror, reflecting back not just their behavior, but the underlying pain or fear driving that behavior. And here's where the real transformation begins. When people are forced to confront their own reflection without the distraction of your reaction, without the comfort of familiar conflict patterns, something remarkable happens. They begin to question their own behavior. Not because you've argued them into a corner, not because you've proven them wrong, but because your silence has created the space for self-reflection. This is why silence can break people in ways that anger never could. Anger meets people where they expect to be met. And conflict, in opposition, in the familiar dance of attack and defend. But silence, conscious, powerful, present silence. This meets them in a place they don't expect, with a response they haven't prepared for. Think about the times in your own life when you've been most transformed. Was it when someone successfully argued you into changing, or was it when someone created the space for you to see yourself clearly? The most profound changes come not from being broken down by another's force, but from being given the space to break through our own illusions. This is what your silence offers others, a gift of self-reflection. When you refuse to engage with drama, when you stay present without getting pulled into reaction, you're essentially holding up a mirror. And in that mirror, people have the opportunity to see themselves as they truly are, not as they pretend to be. But this practice requires tremendous trust. Trust in the process, trust in your own inner strength, and trust in the fundamental human capacity for growth and transformation. It requires you to believe that people can change, not because you force them to, but because you create the conditions where change becomes possible. Remember, the goal isn't to break people's spirits, but to break through the patterns that keep them trapped in cycles of conflict and reaction. Your silence can create the space where old wounds can finally heal, where new understanding can emerge, where genuine connection can replace superficial conflict. This is particularly true in situations where you've been dealing with manipulation or emotional abuse. The manipulator expects you to either fight back or give in. These are the responses they know how to handle. But when you respond with grounded, conscious silence, you step outside their playbook entirely. You demonstrate a kind of strength they may have never encountered before. And yes, this might initially make them uncomfortable. They might increase their attempts to provoke you, to pull you back into familiar patterns. They might try new tactics, push harder buttons, escalate their behavior. But if you can maintain your center, if you can stay in that place of conscious silence, you'll eventually witness something remarkable, the beginning of real change. This is where the true power of silence reveals itself, not in its ability to punish or control others, but in its capacity to create space for authentic transformation. When you choose silence over reaction, presence over provocation, you're not just changing the dynamic of a single interaction. You're altering the entire field of possibility in your relationships. The question that often arises when we discuss the power of silence is, how do I maintain this silence when everything inside me is screaming to react? This is where we must understand the distinction between external silence and internal stillness. Your mouth may be quiet, but if your mind is raging, if your thoughts are spinning with all the things you want to say, you're not yet accessing the true power of transformative silence. The key lies in developing what I call responsive stillness, as I'm on a state of being where your silence isn't just the absence of words, but the presence of complete awareness. This is where your real power lies. When someone comes at you with anger or criticism, instead of immediately planning your defense or thinking about how to respond, you simply observe. You notice their words, their tone, their body language. You notice your own reactions, your own triggers, your own impulses to fight back. But here's the crucial part. You didn't act on those impulses. Instead, you stay in that place of awareness. You breathe. You ground yourself in your own truth. And from this place of centeredness, you allow their words to pass through you like wine through leaves. The leaves move, but the tree remains unmoved. This practice becomes particularly powerful when dealing with chronic critics, those people in our lives who seem to have made it their mission to point out our flaws, question our decisions, and diminish our achievements. Their behavior often stems from their own deep-seated insecurities, their own unresolved pain, their own unfulfilled dreams. When you respond to their criticism with argument or defense, you're actually validating their approach. You're confirming their belief that they have the power to disturb your peace, to make you doubt yourself, to knock you off center. But when you respond with conscious silence, you're demonstrating a kind of strength they may never have encountered before. This silence communicates more powerfully than words ever could. It says, I am so secure in who I am that I don't need to defend myself against your judgment. It says, I see your pain, but I won't let it become my pain. It says, I choose peace over the temporary satisfaction of proving you wrong. Consider the workplace dynamics where this practice becomes invaluable. In every office, there's usually someone who thrives on creating drama, who uses criticism as a way to establish dominance, who mistakes aggression for leadership. These individuals have often built their entire professional identity around their ability to intimidate or manipulate others through words. When you refuse to engage with their drama, when you respond to their provocations with centered silence, you're not just protecting your own peace. You're actually challenging their entire way of being in the world. Your silence forces them to confront the ineffectiveness of their usual tactics. It requires them to find new ways of relating, new ways of communicating, new ways of... But let's be honest, this isn't easy work. There will be times when your silence feels like it's costing you too much. Times when you desperately want to defend yourself, to prove your point, to show others that you're right and they're wrong. This is where the real spiritual practice begins. In these moments, remind yourself that your silence isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It's not surrender. It's strength. It's not giving up. It's rising above. You're choosing to operate from a higher level of consciousness, one where you understand that not every attack requires a defense. Not every provocation demands a response. Not every criticism needs to be countered. This practice becomes particularly powerful in close relationships where patterns of conflict have become deeply entrenched. Think about the family member who always knows how to push your buttons, who seems to derive satisfaction from getting you to react. Their behavior has likely been reinforced over years or decades because it works. It gets them the emotional response they're seeking. But when you begin to respond with conscious silence, you're essentially interrupting this pattern. You're refusing to play your assigned role in their emotional drive. This can be incredibly destabilizing for them because they've built their entire interaction style around your predictable reactions. Your silence creates a space where new patterns of interaction become possible. It's like pressing a reset button on the relationship dynamic. The person who has always relied on provoking reactions from you suddenly finds themselves in uncharted territory. Their usual tactics don't work anymore, and this forces them to either escalate their behavior, which often leads to them seeing their own patterns more clearly, or to find new ways of relating. This is where the breaking happens, not as an act of violence or revenge, but as a natural consequence of their having to confront their own behavior without the distraction of your reaction. It's like holding up a mirror that reflects not just their actions, but the underlying motivations and pain driving those actions. Remember, the goal isn't to break the person, it's to break the pattern. It's to create the conditions where genuine transformation becomes possible. Your silence becomes a catalyst for change, not because it's punitive or hostile, but because it creates the space where truth can emerge. This is what your silence offers others, the gift of self-reflection. When you refuse to engage with drama, when you stay present without getting pulled into reaction, you're essentially holding up a mirror. And in that mirror, people have the opportunity to see themselves as they truly are, not as they pretend to be. But this practice requires tremendous trust. Trust in the process, trust in your own inner strengths, and trust in the fundamental human capacity for growth and transformation. It requires you to believe that people can change, not because you force them to, but because you create the conditions where change becomes possible. Remember, the goal isn't to break people's spirits, but to break through the patterns that keep them trapped in cycles of conflict and reaction. Your silence can create the space where old wounds can finally heal, where new understanding can emerge, where genuine connection can replace superficial conflict. This is particularly true in situations where you've been dealing with manipulation or emotional abuse. The manipulator expects you to either fight back or give in. These are the responses they know how to handle. But when you respond with grounded, conscious silence, you step outside their playbook entirely. You demonstrate a kind of strength they may have never encountered before. And yes, this might initially make them uncomfortable. They might increase their attempts to provoke you, to pull you back into familiar patterns. They might try new tactics, push harder buttons, escalate their behavior. But if you can maintain your center, if you can stay in that place of conscious silence, you'll eventually witness something remarkable, the beginning of real change. This is where the true power of silence reveals itself. Not in its ability to punish or control others, but in its capacity to create space for authentic transformation. When you choose silence over reaction, presence over provocation, you're not just changing the dynamic of a single interaction, you're altering the entire field of possibility in your relationships. This truth-revealing aspect of silence is perhaps its most powerful quality. When you remain silent in the face of attack or criticism, you're essentially saying, I trust in the power of truth to reveal itself. You're demonstrating a kind of faith. Faith in the process, faith in the other person's capacity for growth, faith in the transformative power of conscious presence. And here's something remarkable about this practice. It not only has the power to transform others, it inevitably transforms you as well. As you develop the capacity to maintain silence in the face of provocation, you'll find yourself becoming more centered, more grounded, more connected to your own inner wisdom. You'll begin to notice that your need to defend yourself diminishes. Your attachment to being right loosens its grip. Your fear of others' judgments starts to fade. You discover a kind of freedom that comes from knowing that your worth isn't determined by others' opinions of you, that your peace isn't dependent on external validation, that your strength doesn't require constant demonstration. This is the paradox of transformative silence. In choosing not to speak, you make your most powerful statement. In choosing not to react, you create the strongest response. In choosing to stay present without engaging in conflict, you demonstrate the highest form of engagement. Let's talk about what happens when we commit fully to this practice of transformative silence. Because what I'm sharing with you isn't just a technique for dealing with difficult people. It's a pathway to profound personal transformation. When you master the art of conscious silence, you begin to experience life from an entirely different level of awareness. Think about the last time you were in a situation that typically would have triggered an immediate emotional response. Maybe it was criticism from a superior at work, or a passive-aggressive comment from a family member, or even just someone cutting you off in traffic. Your habitual response would have been immediate defense, anger, justification, or attack. But what if, in that moment, you chose to create a space between the trigger and your response? What if, instead of immediately reacting, You allowed yourself to sink into a place of deep silence, not the silence of suppression, where you're holding back what you really want to say, but the silence of true presence, where you're fully aware of both your own internal state and the reality of the situation around you. This is where real power lies. In that space between stimulus and response, you have the opportunity to access a kind of strength that most people never experience because they're too busy reacting. This strength doesn't come from dominating others or proving yourself right. It comes from being so deeply centered in your own truth that external provocations lose their power over you. The practice becomes particularly powerful when dealing with people who have made a habit of using emotional manipulation to control others. These individuals have usually developed sophisticated strategies for pushing people's buttons, for provoking reactions, for creating drama that serves their needs. They're experts at reading emotional responses and using them to maintain control. But what happens when they encounter someone who refuses to play that game? Someone who responds to manipulation not with counter-manipulation, but with grounded, conscious presence. Someone who meets their attempts to create drama, not with engagement or withdrawal, but with the kind of silence that comes from deep inner strength. At first, they often don't know how to respond. Their familiar tools don't work. Their usual tactics fail to produce the expected results. This can lead to an escalation of their behavior as they try harder to provoke a response. But if you can maintain your center during this phase, something remarkable begins to happen. The manipulator starts to experience something they may never have encountered before, the reflection of their own behavior in the mirror of your silence. Without your emotional engagement to distract from or justify their actions, they're forced to confront the reality of their own behavior. This is where the real transformation begins. But let's be clear about something. This practice isn't about being passive or becoming a doormat. There will be times when speaking up is exactly what's needed. The key is learning to distinguish between situations that require your voice and those. This discernment comes from staying deeply connected to your own inner wisdom. When you operate from this level of consciousness, you begin to understand that true power doesn't lie in your ability to affect others through your words or actions. It lies in your ability to maintain your center regardless of what's happening around you. This is the kind of power that can't be taken away because it doesn't depend on external circumstances. Consider the profound shift that occurs in your relationships when you master this practice. People who once saw you as an emotional target begin to recognize that their old strategies no longer work. Those who relied on pushing your buttons to get what they want find themselves dealing with someone who can't be manipulated through emotional provocation. This creates a kind of energetic boundary that's far more effective than any verbal defense or confrontation could ever be. Your silence becomes a force field of consciousness that naturally repels drama and manipulation while creating space for authentic connection and genuine communication. But here's where many people misunderstand this practice. They think it's about becoming cold or disconnected. Nothing could be further from the truth. The silence I'm talking about is fully engaged, deeply present, and profoundly compassionate. It comes from a place of understanding that most harmful behavior stems from pain, and that the person trying to hurt you is often hurting themselves even more. This understanding doesn't mean you accept or enable harmful behavior. Instead, it allows you to respond from a place of wisdom rather than reaction. Your silence becomes a teaching, not a punishment. It creates space for transformation rather than perpetuating cycles of conflict. The practice becomes particularly powerful when dealing with chronic patterns in long-term relationships. Think about the family dynamics that have persisted for generations, the workplace conflicts that seem impossible to resolve, the personal relationships that keep cycling through the same problems. These patterns persist because everyone involved keeps playing their assigned roles, keeps reacting in predictable ways, keeps engaging with the drama in familiar patterns. But when one person steps out of this dance through the practice of conscious silence, the entire dynamic begins to shift. This shift doesn't happen because you're trying to change others. It happens because your changed response creates a new space of possibility. when you refuse to engage with drama, when you maintain your center in the face of provocation, when you respond to manipulation with grounded presence, you're essentially creating a new field of energy in which transformation becomes possible. Think of it like this. When someone throws emotional chaos at you, they're expecting it to either stick to you or bounce back to them. These are the responses they know how to handle. But when you respond with conscious silence, it's like their emotional energy passes through you and returns to them, transformed by your presence. This is why silence can break patterns that anger never could. Anger meets force with force, creating resistance and escalation. But silence, true, conscious, present silence, creates a space where force dissolves, where resistance becomes unnecessary, where transformation can occur naturally. The practice requires tremendous trust. Trust in yourself, trust in the process, trust in the fundamental human capacity for growth and change. It asks you to believe that people can transform, not because you force them to, but because you create the conditions where transformation becomes possible. This is advanced spiritual work, but it's work that every one of us is capable of doing. It starts with the simple decision to respond differently to provocation, to choose presence over reaction, to trust in the power of silence to create change in ways that words never could.